John, and I'm here in Charlemagne Record Exchange in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm here with my good friend Alejandro Escovedo,
That's right.
and we're good friends, so I call him Al. So,
I prefer Alejandro.
Alejandro, I will do that. But how are you today?
I'm great, man.
Happy birthday to you. Today's your birthday.
No, tomorrow's my
Tomorrow is his birthday.
Yeah.
Okay.
birthday. The Italians.
They're
think that
a
it's
day
my-
ahead, so they were
think it's my birthday.
celebrating early for you.
It doesn't take much for them to celebrate either.
They will celebrate at the drop of a hat.
Pretty
won't they?
much, yeah.
But they're a great band.
Joyous fellows, yeah.
They're very joyous fellows. I love them so much.
They're amazing
such
band.
good musicians.
Yeah.
And they just have such great energy,
Yeah,
like
they
everywhere
do.
they go. And this is the album that you did with them.
Right.
It's your latest album called The Crossing. And it's a wonderful picture on the front that was taken by your wife,
That's
Nancy.
right, Nancy.
And tell us a little bit about this record, because it's really, I feel like the record, you told me a little bit about it 2 years ago when it was in the planning stages.
Right.
And when it came out, I just was like, yes, this is everything you talked about and more. Like, I felt like you gave us a great story. So just tell just a little
Well,
bit
the story basically is about two young men. One of them is Italian. He's from southern Italy in Calabria. His name is Salvo. The other young boy's name is Diego, and he's from Saltillo in northern Mexico in the state of Coahuila.
Mhm.
And they both meet while they're working at Salvo's uncle's Italian restaurant in Galveston, Texas. And it's there that they devise this plan as they're, trading records and books and talking about film. They find that they have a bond in that they love, like, all the bands that led to American punk rock.
Mhm.
So they love the Velvet Underground, the MC5, the Stooges, Question Mark and the Mysterians, whoever, like all these cool bands they love. And then they love the Beat Poets, Ginsberg, Corso, Burroughs, all the great writers from that period of time. And they also have a fascination with the films of the 70s in America. Peck and Paw and, I was trying to think of Samuel Fuller and Nicholas Ray and all those great directors from that period of time, Antonioni. So it's that America that they decide that they are going to go out and look for.
But they don't exactly find it, do they?
They do not find it. They find something quite different. And, their innocence their wide-eyed innocence leads them to believe that America is a country that is free and democratic and where the arts really flourish, because of the support of the people and the government and whatnot. But what they find is that it's a very different America, especially the America that they face, And so, we lose one of the characters along the way, Salvo. Diego is left alone at the end of the album, at the end of the story. And he contemplates whether the journey was even worth it at that point,
How much of this story is drawn, because a lot of the influences that you mentioned are your own influences.
Yeah.
So how much of Diego is you, and how much of Salvo is
I would say quite a bit,
Antonio?
that we based them on our aesthetic, shared aesthetic that we have in music and film and
What was the
literature.
connection that the two of you made, like your cultures and?
Well, Antonio has been to Texas several times,
Mhm.
since I believe the early 90s or the 90s. And so, a lot of musicians travel through close to Italy that they would play with. Hal Gelb, they throw a festival every year in the town that they live in. Los Lobos have played, I played. So they're very familiar with American music. And yet at the same time, what's fascinating about them is they're not trying to mimic an American band.
Yeah.
They have their own flavor.
really do.
Yeah, and approach to music. So that's what really drew me to them. But I think that the characters both possess a lot of Antonio and I. And when I was writing the lyrics, I wrote most of the lyrics in the studio, probably 95%.
Where did you record it at?
In a little town outside of, well, actually, it was just outside of Villafranca in a studio called Cosa Beat, which is an old farmhouse out in the country.
Mm-hmm.
We had an Italian cook who cooked for us every day. We had all the musicians you saw on stage last
Mm-hmm.
night with us. Plus, we brought in some friends of theirs, to sing. And Emma Morton was a singer. She's a great singer.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, she's a fascinating performer also. So we had, it was a full-on Italian experience.
And you had a lot of guest artists on the record.
We did.
Tell us a little bit about Wayne Kramer. I know, as you were mentioning, shouting
Wayne
out
Kramer,
to Wayne
the
last night,
MC5.
and
James Williamson of the
James
Stooges.
Williamson,
We had John Perry and Peter Parrott of The Only Ones.
The Only Ones. Great band, by the way.
Yes, absolutely cool band. And Joe Ely, the great Joe Ely.
We were just listening to that song, and that is such a great song, Silver City.
Silver City.
How did you and Joe have done several tours, and you've worked together over the years?
Yeah, Joe was kind of like my mentor as far as like getting my solo act together. He was kind of the example that I followed.
Did he kind of push you in that?
Well, he
direction,
would
or
take
just-
me with him. He has a beautiful kind of gentle approach to being a mentor,
Yeah.
and he would just kind of take me on tours with him, and I would have the best seat in the house watching him perform. And now we've done, I think, about 3 or 4 years in a row. Every summer we go out and do a tour where we share the stage together.
Yeah.
We're both on stage, like you and I are,
Yeah.
playing songs
And just
telling
kind of talk
stories.
about, yeah. So kind of like in the round, like they do in Nashville.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
type of thing.
But
Yeah.
more about sharing stories,
Yeah.
and there's no set list, so we just play off each other.
We loved it when you played solo here at Saturn, and where you really got to tell the stories behind the songs, because some of the songs can be almost surrealistic sometimes, and it's like you telling the story. Like, I didn't know Deer Head on the Wall. I had no idea what that was about until you explained it a little bit, and so it's great hearing those stories of how you came to write the songs and what they mean, and because they mean things to different people as
Absolutely.
they digest them, and it means something to them. So
The beauty of that is that you hear it as a story, and then you hear it as a song, right?
yeah,
And even though, like, I wrote this song called The Ladder, I think it's called, and it was all based on seeing this man who was in Venice Beach. You know how crazy Venice Beach is. And he was this guy that was just like this, African-American statue, basically. He was perfectly built, and he was this big guy, bald head. He had no hair on his body, and he was all oiled up, and he just had like a Speedo on, And he had these 2 buckets, and inside the buckets were these snakes, these big, huge snakes that he would perform with and climb a ladder. So the first, I'd climb a ladder just to see you was the first one. So it started this whole thing,
yeah.
And so, inspiration comes from from everything, really.
As a
in my
lyricist, you were talking about the beat poets earlier before.
Mm-hmm.
What type of poets influenced you?
Well, I was lucky in that, Lou Reed and Smokey Robinson were probably the most influential
Right on.
poets, But I think that for me it was like, I read all the Rimbaud and Baudelaire, all the French hashish poets. I also loved, I love writers like Raymond Carver, which really kind of lent more to my style of writing, at least what I try to do,
Do you ever write lyrics first and then music, or is it
Yeah, a lot of times.
a lot of times?
Yeah.
Do you always write stuff out as like a notebook situation, or do you?
I try, but now there's so many songs that I kind of come up with an idea for the record and what it's loosely going to be based on and what it's going to be about, and then I write to that subject,
Sure.
So like if I have a record, let's say like Phases and Stages, which is that Willie Nelson album,
So
where
good.
one side is the
Great.
man's
Yes.
side of a
That's a
divorce,
great-
the other side is the
Yeah.
woman's side. I find that fascinating.
It's
It's
definitely a great
amazing.
album,
And like Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, all those great records. Or books, really. They're books and movies and songs. So That's always been my thing.
How have movies? What movies have influenced you?
Well, I studied film first, right? So I did not want to be a musician. I wanted to be a filmmaker.
Yeah.
And we were making a movie about the worst band in the world, loosely based on the Stooges, right?
Right.
Like the Dum Dum Boys kind of thing, you know?
Right.
And so we thought we looked cool, and we would be the band in the movie. And since you know they were shitty, we would just play that part anyway. We didn't know how to play, you know. So I think I knew a couple of chords on the guitar. We borrowed, otherwise known as stole, a guitar from a music store, and that began the Nuns. And once we started making the movie, we had so much fun being a band.
You just kept it going.
We just kept it
Did
going.
that coincide with what was going on in punk at the time, or was
Well,
that
punk
preceding
kind of
it?
surrounded us because this is '75, right? So we're getting rumblings of bands in, you know, the Ramones were the first band to come through San
Right.
Francisco. They played at a spaghetti restaurant, you know, Italian restaurant, and maybe 30 of us were there. Everybody started a band, you know. But we were the Nuns before the Ramones got there, right? We were working on being the Nuns.
Interesting. So you were slightly ahead of the curve on that.
A little
one.
bit,
You're
yeah.
like, hey, wait a minute,
Yeah.
we could actually do something.
And it
like
was
this.
always cool to like read Enemy or Melody Maker and see the Sex Pistols.
See what's going on.
and
Yeah.
The Clash. And,
Did
you
you
know,
feel
all the
like
different bands.
we mentioned the Stooges, and did you feel like, oh, now this type of music, like the Stooges MC5, like that's now there's finally some people doing that? Like when you saw the Ramones and that punk thing happening, were you like,
Well, we
yeah,
were
this is
already
it.
doing it because our idea for a band was to combine the Velvet Underground and the Stooges into one band, you know. And so Detroit was always a big influence, you know. And regardless of who was doing what, we were going to get to our sound, you know.
There's a line on the record where you say, on The Crossing, where you say, I saw the Zeros and they looked like me. Is that
Yeah.
is that the correct line? So tell us a little bit about what that line means to you and who the Zeros.
Well, what it means
the
is,
Zeros were.
well, the Zeros are my brother Javier's band, you know, and they were like the first band to put out a single on Bomp Records on the West Coast, right? And that was early. That was '76, I think, you know. And so the idea is that there aren't a lot of Chicanos in bands at the time, right? There
Right.
weren't.
Well, you mentioned Question Mark and
Yeah,
Mysterians. So.
yeah. There were them. There were Sir Douglas Quintet. There was Sam the Sham, Pharaohs. Of course, Richie Valens was a
early.
big idol. But there weren't a lot. Maybe the band Love, I think, had some Chicanos in the band. So there weren't a lot of people that you could look to as role models, right? And so when you're being excluded in that sense, it's kind of hard to find your own place, you know? So seeing a band of people who look like you and do what you want to be doing
Yeah.
is so inspiring,
yeah,
right?
it really is. Yeah.
And so that was, you know, that's what that's all about. Because, you know, in a strange way, the record's also about racism, right? So the racism that I've experienced in music has been pretty profound, you know, just as it was before I was in a band.
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit, because I notice every article I read, it's always Mexican American.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel? I feel like hyphens kind of. It's always, you're not just American and then Mexican. You know, it's a weird. They don't do that too. It's only African Americans or Mexican Americans. You know, they always put that on the other, as it were. So, tell us a little bit about you were talking about this before, and this racism. Was there some acceptance in the punk rock?
Well, that's where we. You know, that's why Diego and Salvo are searching for punk rock, because it's there that they find the community.
They can be accepted.
Yeah, they're accepted there. And for us, it was the same thing when we started playing punk rock music. I mean, it spanned every type of person, you know, from females to transgender to African American, reggae, you know, rockabilly, southern, you know, country, everything, right? And so we would put on shows where, you know, Junior Murvin would play and Ray Campy would play,
Yeah.
and then the Dills would play.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a great
and they
bill
were
right there.
amazing. You know,
Yeah.
so like that was the thing. You know, it was all inclusive. You know, and
Did you feel punk rock was more of an aesthetic that instead of like a style is more of like do it yourself, like you don't have to be technically the best, but
I would say, you know, it's weird to say that it's a philosophy, and that's probably misleading, but it was a way of thinking,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
That, you know, we were never going to get into Winterland because Bill Graham owned San Francisco
Right.
and all the clubs that he owned, and then the radio was not playing anything that we liked. You know, they weren't playing the Stooges.
right.
They weren't playing, you know, it wasn't until the Ramones came that they started to play punk rock music, you know.
And even then, they were scared of it.
They were
It was
scared,
almost
but
like the kiss of death. you
San
know?
Francisco was different because it was a very open city,
Yeah.
you know. It was heavily gay populated city, so it was accepting of a lot, you know.
Yeah. Since we're in a record store, what were some of the very first records that you ever owned or remember
Well, I
hearing?
remember the Big Bopper Chantilly Lace.
That's a great one. I love that.
And I remember Jerry Lee, you know, Jerry Lee Lewis. Fats was big.
Yeah.
I love
the
Fats.
50s rockers because they
Yeah.
kind of had to, there was no template for them. Like
No.
they just made it up. Like they had
Little
influences,
Richard, like
but
nobody was like
you can't.
Little,
Yeah, I mean, and then everybody tried to start copying his style, and that
Right.
became a style. But they really had no blueprint in the beginning.
Right. And they were so individualistic and so, you know, they were pioneers, you know. And they really faced a lot of odds, I think, you know, as
Mhm.
musicians. So,
Do you think that cultural revolution that was happening in the 50s, was there any similarity to what happened in the 70s with punk rock? Because I feel like sometimes that, like the punk rock, they were trying to do in some essence what the 50s guys were doing in terms of just let's make this kind of loud and obnoxious and piss off our parents, and there was a
Exactly.
certain sort of like let's get back to what rock and roll when it was fun.
well,
kind of
that
thing.
was the main idea, was getting back to that spirit of rock and roll that was rebellious and, you know, did not have any concern for commerciality, really just was kind of there to
Yeah.
make people move, you know, and think, hopefully, you know.
Now you were talking about your brother, and your family has a lot of musicians and I'll let everybody out there Google everybody who's we won't go over that again, but Alejandro has a lot of people in his family who are musicians, and were there different factions? Like I know you and your brother were maybe kind of like the rock and roll, and there was like
Yeah, like out of 12, 13 kids, the older generation is all drummers.
mm-hmm.
And they all played Latin jazz and salsa and stuff, you know. But like my brother Pete played on everything from Boss Skaggs records to Chabriath, you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he played on that
Yeah,
record.
that's
It's pretty
great,
funny.
yeah.
And he played on so many records, and Sheila, of course, played on everything from Gloria Estefan to Marvin Gaye records and toured with Marvin. And Marvin would actually give her and Juan, my nephew, their own 15-minute little segment in the show. He loved them so much, you know. So they've done a lot of different types of music, and they were all drummers and really top class musicians, right?
Yeah.
And then from me down, we're all guitar players, rockers, and you know, we do what we do well, but not nearly the musicianship that our older brothers have.
Some would differ, but I feel what
You know
you're
what I
saying.
mean, though,
I
yeah.
do know what.
In fact, we were always kind of like embarrassed to tell them where we were playing at first, you know?
Right.
And they would find out, and then we'd look over, and there they would be
there
on
supporting
the
you.
side of the stage spurring us on.
How did you go from punk rock to like the singer songwriter Texas thing? How did that happen? Was that when you moved to Austin, or
I think that, you know, like, it's funny because I've always wondered why a guy who loves the Stooges and Metal Machine music and albums like Berlin and, you know, all the Velvet Underground albums with their dissonance and kind of folky stuff too. If you think about the Velvets, they were very folky, right? And then when I started writing songs, it wasn't glitter rock at all. It was kind of more singer-songwriter stuff, you know, more pensive kind of personal kind of things.
did that come from Towns Van Zandt or
I
any
think
of the,
that
Guy Clark? Or
what
any of those guys?
happened was I finally started writing songs at the age of 30. I wrote my first song for the True Believers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then when the True Believers broke up, I had been in Austin for now almost 10 years, right? And following Towns and Blaze and Jimmy Dale and Joe Ely and those guys, Jubal Clark. Did you ever hear Jubal Clark?
Yes.
He was an amazing songwriter.
Mm-hmm.
Rich Minus, who
Yeah.
wrote songs for the Texas Tornadoes. So all those guys were around, and that's all I saw, basically.
Yeah.
That and the blues guys,
Yeah.
right?
So that started rubbing off on you a little
So
bit.
I think that really was kind of what, especially Towns,
Yeah.
was kind of like, okay, I can really talk about things that are pretty messed up inside me and put them to song.
Put it in a song.
And
yeah.
somehow work it out,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So that was what came out, you know?
You were mentioning the True Believers, and I have to say, in this book, Texas Music by Rick Coster, you are credited with inventing cowpunk. So my question is, what is cowpunk, and why did you invent it?
Well, I have no idea what cowpunk is, and I take no credit for that term, but you know, the press just always
They didn't know
needs-
what to call it when
They
it
didn't
was
know.
like it was that weird mix of punk and some.
You know, when we were traveling around as rank and file, once we got, you know, to Austin, then started touring, we mentioned earlier, Jason and the Scorchers were the only other band that was really
Right.
doing it. And a lot of the guys, when we played LA, would stand on the side of the stage and watch as the bands like Green on Red and stuff, they weren't really, you know, bands yet, you know. So we kind of were one of the first, you know, of those bands. And it's funny because I always feel like Rank and File doesn't get the credit
Not
they
at all.
deserve for what they did, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you guys were on Slash with Rank and File was on Slash
Well,
for a while.
yeah, right.
Yeah. And who was the member that passed away last?
Tony
Tony.
Kidman, yeah.
And he was a big part of your of that as
He
well.
was a huge part because Tony, you know, Tony and I really kind of started Rank and File when we were in San Francisco. There was a show, the Avengers and the Dills were putting on a show. We said, hey, why don't we just put together a band, we'll call it Rank and File. And we played Muddy Waters, Joe Higgs, Marty Robbins songs, you know. We did just all the songs that we loved. I think we did like 7 songs, you know, for just a short set. But it was 3 of the members of the Nuns and Tony on bass, you know, and singing. And so that started what became Rank and File, you know. And we did a recording with that band at the Automat, in you know, where the Clash recorded, Give 'Em Enough Rope. I think they recorded there.
Yeah.
And then when I moved to New York, you know, I started playing with other people. I left the Nuns. The Nuns went back to Frisco. I stayed in New York, living at the Chelsea Hotel. When Sid and Nancy arrived, I was there because we had played the last Sex Pistols show in Winterland, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they came. Nancy was killed. Everyone kind of left to Chelsea. I remained in New York and started playing with Judy Nylon,
Yeah.
who was wonderful. I loved playing with her. I learned so much from her. She was a wonderful teacher, you know. She had played in a band called Snatch with Pat Paladin. She had sang on John Cale's records, backup singer. Judy's Jungle, Brian Eno's record, you know, that's about Judy, I believe. And so, like, you know, when I met her, she's the type of woman who's very powerful, very smart, you know. She just kind of walked up to me and said, you're going to be in my band. And
You couldn't say no.
we rehearsed one night in the hotel room. The next night we played at Max's Kansas City, and in the front row was Chris Spedding, John Cale, and Brian Eno.
Wow.
And that was my birth by baptism by fire.
By fire.
Yeah. And I remember Cale came back and told Judy, you should keep him. And it was great because eventually Cale and I worked together. He produced my album when I came
Yeah,
back
that was a great one.
from the dead.
Yeah. And yeah, and you've been doing great ever since then. What is the next phase for you after this album is getting great reviews? I saw it was on a lot of year-end lists. I think
Yeah.
it was number 5 on the No Depression
Yeah.
list of Americana albums from 2018.
Yeah.
What's after you're doing a tour now with Don Antonio?
Yeah.
And after you do this tour, what's up next for you?
Well, Nancy and I are going to. They're presenting me with an award in Austin, the Towns Van Sant Award,
That's fantastic.
which is a big deal.
That is an honor.
In Texas.
Yeah.
It's like getting the Shakespeare Award or
Yeah,
something.
it
you know?
is.
So I'm really honored by that.
What is that happening?
February 27th. And then on the 28th, Nancy and I get on a plane and go to Australia and New Zealand for 3 weeks. And I tour solo over there. And then I come back and we go back to Europe to tour with Don Antonio one more time. And then I come back and concentrate on the States and Canada for the rest of the year and making another record.
Yeah. So, what is your thought process like? Last time I talked to you, you were touring on one album, but you were already thinking of the next one. Is that what you do as you're touring? Kind of like, are you sort of already trying to get ideas, or?
Because I think every album, like I'm sure on your record, there's a song that's going to lead you to the next record.
Sure.
Maybe it might be a couple or a few, but suddenly you tapped into something that really strikes you, right?
Yeah.
You know, and you go, man, I really want to pursue that sound. I want to pursue that kind of narrative or story or whatever it may be. And there's always songs on records that lead me to the next record. So right now, I'm still trying to figure out what that is, but you know, I know I'll find it. You know?
I'm sure you will.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome,
here with me
man.
today. It's been a pleasure, Alejandro.
Wow.
Thank you
Always
so
a
much
pleasure, yeah.
for your patience, and
No, good luck.
thanks
man.
again. And
good luck with your record. and
thank
stuff.
you. That
Yeah.
means that
it's
means
a beautiful
lot to me.
record, by the way.
That means a lot.
I want to tell the world out there.
You can say it louder. That's fine. Ask for it at your record store. Thank you so much for your
You're
time.
welcome, bro.
Thank you for coming into the store today, and we'll see you guys next time on Magic City Music with Jubal John. Thank you.
Adios.